All right, Daniel, we've been looking at the first 4 chapters so far, and today we're going to be getting into chapter 5. Just as a small recap, again, chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic, and they form a chiasm. That's something we had discussed. Chapter 2, again, is about Nebuchadnezzar's first dream that mentions this image of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. And that corresponds to 4 kingdoms. Again, we haven't gone to it yet, but then in chapter 7, we're going to see a vision that Daniel has, and it has these 4 beasts, which also correspond to 4 kingdoms. Then Daniel chapter 3, what we looked at was this image, this golden image that Nebuchadnezzar created, and these 3 men that weren't willing to bow down to it, and how they were thrown into the fiery furnace. Chapter 6, that we'll get to, that will be the part where Daniel, continues to pray to his God, and he's, as a result, thrown into the lion's den. So it's about these men that stood for God, for doing what God would want, or stood against what God would not want. But they displayed courage and so forth. So they kind of each correspond. And then a few weeks ago, we've been looking at Daniel 4. That was Nebuchadnezzar's second dream, in which there was this central message, 4 and 5 forming this central area of Daniel. And the central message really had to do with God's supremacy, that God reigns, that he has dominion. And it's an eternal dominion. It's an eternal kingdom. And it's not just starting and ending with creation and then when he comes again, but it's even now. And that he is in charge of kings and kingdoms, and he establishes them and he removes them. So that's part of the central message that we have within here. We're going to see that message again presented in Daniel chapter 5. As we get into Daniel chapter 5, one thing to note is Daniel chapter 4 ended with a time that we don't really know exactly when the time period was, but it's understood that it's likely near the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. As you recall, he was looking out on Babylonian city, remarking at the city about the city of Babylon and everything, and it's thought that, well, all of his building projects probably had completed within Babylon, and he was just, looking over all these projects that he had done during his reign, and that's part of the time in which he then was changed by God to live like a beast out in the forest or wherever they ended up having him. We now come to Daniel 5, which is going to be the fall of Babylon itself, of the empire, the end of Babylon. And in Daniel 5, we're going to meet this guy by the name of King Belshazzar. And one of the questions that's asked is, who is King Belshazzar? So one of the things we get into here is, what has happened? So Nebuchadnezzar, he died in 562 BC, and his son took over, this guy by the name of Evil Merodach. He also went by a slightly different name. This is the name that he's referred to in 2 Kings, though. At the very end of 2 Kings, you'll read about this king of Babylon called Evil Merodach. And so he's Nebuchadnezzar's son. He came to power afterwards. And as you can see there, his reign did not last all that long. It lasted just 2 years. And then he was killed by someone that was Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law, Neriglissar. I don't know exactly how that name is said, but he came to power after killing Nebuchadnezzar's son. He reigned for 6 years. He died, and then when he died, his son, Neriglissar's son, which is kind of, since he was his son-in-law, he was also Nebuchadnezzar's grandson in a way. His son came to power and was soon assassinated in this very same year. So you see a lot of instability. We also know that Babylon, as an empire, is in a declining stage after Nebuchadnezzar. He was a very smart ruler, and he was, part of what was responsible for organizing Babylon and helping to establish the empire in its way. And we'd already talked about that in chapter 2, how Nebuchadnezzar was important for bringing about the prosperity of Babylon, and God was responsible for bringing about Nebuchadnezzar. as far as all of what Nebuchadnezzar's abilities were. And so he was assassinated by Nabonidus and some others. And then Nabonidus, he's the last guy who reigned. And so, the question then is like, well, we don't see this Belshazzar guy because the last king is Nabonidus. And something to know about Nabonidus is Nabonidus is not someone who really stayed in Babylon. He had campaigns and other things that he did, so he was mostly absent from the city. He was out about doing other things. And so he had an eldest son who was named Belshazzar. And so he was established as a co-regent so that, Nabonidus could be out and about, and really Belshazzar would be taking care of administrative and everything else, the business back there in the city of Babylon. And so he is a king. It's kind of an understanding that he's also sort of the second one in charge, and that kind of gets relevance here in chapter 5 when you think about what happens in chapter 5, because he was the second highest in Babylon as co-regent, as king. Like everyone there would know him as the king because Nabonidus is basically absent. Nabonidus also later on does encounter the Persian army, and he flees from it. So again, you could say at this time he's already abandoned them in a way, knowing that the Persian army was on its way. It's outside the gates, so to speak. And so, Belshazzar is pretty much on his own at this point as well. But anyways, Belshazzar, his oldest son, second highest, is who is talked about here. And we'll begin reading then in Daniel chapter 5. And it says, King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. And just to pause here for a second, something that should be remembered is from our understanding of the rest of the text, the Persian army just didn't creep up like they didn't know the Persian army was coming. It's kind of understood the Persian army was outside the gates. And what they're doing is they're holding a feast. He decides to hold a feast during this time. And one of the reasons people talk about, well, how could he, there's a Persian army very close by. How could he just decide to have a feast? Like, it's kind of understood that if they go outside the walls, it's not going to go well for them. They've already been defeated. Their army's already been defeated. And so one of the things is the walls of Babylon were a very impressive feat. And I think it mentioned about 2 weeks ago, it was a double-walled city. And these walls were pretty great. One of the things that was thought here is that they probably had a great amount of confidence in the walls of Babylon. They said, you know what, they're out there, but it's going to take a lot for them to get in here. And so they're just, either waiting it out or something like that. They said, we have confidence in these walls that we're going to be safe in here. And so there's different ideas of like, why would he hold a feast or whatever? But, it's kind of like, well, maybe he did it for morale. Maybe he just did it for, we don't really know. The text doesn't say. But it is kind of that understanding that they held a feast, and it's during the siege, and it's, understood that a reason why you would have a feast amidst all this is probably because you were confident in your walls. So anyways, that's part of the background we see as well for what he's doing here. And he's inviting all these people there maybe to bolster courage or whatever, morale, who knows. So anyways, beginning in chapter 2, it says, Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. And again, we saw these vessels being taken early in Daniel chapter 1. I think it was verse 2, that it mentions that the vessels were taken from the temple, and they were put in the temple of the Babylonian god. So that's where they stayed, and it seems like that's where they remained. And one of the questions that you come here is, there's a few different questions. One of the things they say is, it says Nebuchadnezzar his father. And one of the things people look at and they say, well, Belshazzar's father was Nabonidus. So what is it doing there? And there's a few different ways that things have been explained there. They said, in this word for father in the ancient Aramaic or whatever, they said it could mean direct father, or one of your ancestors, maybe your grandfather, something like that. And how we get to grandfather is Nabonidus' wife is understood to be, most probably, was Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. And so he kind of is then a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And there's also other commentaries that said there was a find that was found regarding Babylon, and that word was used, and it was also used to refer to just someone who had been king before you. So anyways, this word when it says their father doesn't mean, that he's actually his first father, but could have been, a meaning of grandfather, or it could have just been meant to say he was a prior ruler of Babylon. As we see the text here, it seems more congruent with this thinking of, grandfather. You could say father as grandfather in this way. And the second thing is, why would he take these vessels? And that's something that's not answered, but it's something to think about as far as what is the mindset of Belshazzar? Because later on, there are consequences for this action. And it seems to be very intentional. Out of all the things he was thinking about doing during this time, he wanted to take the vessels of the Judean God, of this God that had taught Nebuchadnezzar a lesson about supremacy. And so some of the things you have to wonder about that is, did he, well, it seems, as we read later on, he did understand about what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. That was not a private thing. Chapter 4, as we read, was something that Nebuchadnezzar himself wrote to all the kingdom of Babylon. Everyone would have known what God did to him, and this acknowledgement of God's supremacy. One of the things I think about is, did he, he may have also known about what we saw in chapter 2, which was about the head of gold, but then silver, which was denoting that there would be an empire coming after them. There was this Judean God had said, the empire of Babylon would cease, and another empire would succeed them. And you have to wonder, if it's in some way a defiance of that sort of proclamation of the Judean God that said, oh, there's going to be another empire that takes over. The question is this the Babylonian king that showed the Persians his wealth? I don't know of anything that necessarily says that. I mean, there is Hezekiah that showed the Babylonians his wealth, and that's part of what we saw earlier in chapter 1. There was consequences for Hezekiah showing the wealth and so forth, and that's also why there was a prophet proclaimed against Hezekiah, saying, as a result of this, your family, the part of the royal family will be taken to Babylon, which we understand Daniel seems to be related in some way to the royal family, and also that the vessels were taken as a part of that proclamation against what Hezekiah did back then. But yeah, then anyways, it does seem to be something in defiance, though, of this Persians is there, and there may be people that understand that, the Judean God said that this Babylonian Empire is going to be ending. And maybe he did it in some defiance, we don't know. But this is 66 years after Daniel first comes here. So this is quite a bit of time has elapsed. That dream, I think, was after 3 years, right? So this is 63 years after Nebuchadnezzar's first dream, where that was revealed. And I think if you think about something like 20 years or so, 20-some years after the point where Nebuchadnezzar has died and so forth. So anyways, it is understood, I think, later on that he is aware, though, of what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, and this is part of his defiance of the God that would show his supremacy towards Babylon. So anyways, it goes on here and says, sorry, I lost my place here. And so verse 3, right? It says, then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines, drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Immediately, the finger of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. And the king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. And just pausing for a second there, one of the things that we remark here is this finger that immediately appears by God, it puts it on the wall, and it says, as it notes there, it says opposite the lampstand. And one thing that's being conveyed there is that this was to be very visible to everyone there. It's put opposite the lampstand in a place that would have good lighting so that everyone would see, not just Belshazzar, but everyone there at the feast would clearly be able to see this hand and this message that God's conveying. And so as part of that as well, you see, I'm sure, it mentions the king was alarmed. I'm sure all the guests were alarmed pretty well. And this immediate action, of God in response to this, again, it seems to be this defiance of this Judean God in what he's doing. And not just that, but the defilement of all these vessels that had been dedicated to God, that had been taken, that had been stored somewhere beneath, some other Babylonian god, but now are used in a greatly irreverent way. And so then we have the same thing, this pattern that I mentioned in chapter 4 is kind of also in chapter 2. We see someone in their great mode of security and safety all of a sudden have all that stripped away, just like prior, and that causes him to need to search for answers, to search for truth. Same sort of pattern as we see before. And where does he go? Of course, he goes searching for truth in the places where he thinks he's found truth before. All of his astrologers and enchanters, Chaldeans, so forth. And, of course, doesn't find truth there. As it says, he's bringing this great offer where he says, I will give them, they will be the third highest in the kingdom. And that kind of makes sense based on what we've mentioned already. Nabonidus is the highest. Belshazzar is the second. So he can't give him anything more than the third. And some texts have said, it may not be first, second, third ruler, but it may be triumvirate. Some other texts mention that may be, a co-ruler with all of them. Any which way, he was offering a pretty lofty reward. About the greatest position he could offer is basically what he's offering here, third highest. And so, as understandable, very much wants to understand what this is, find the truth, and basically for him, it's kind of like sparing no expense, whatever it takes to find out what the truth is. And it says, then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. And to me, it seems, when it brings out this part in the text here, I had to think a little bit about this because one of the things is his color changed, and it mentions his color changed, and his knees knocked together. He became even more fearful. It happens first when he sees the writing of the finger on the wall, which, understandably so, would be pretty frightening to anyone if all of a sudden, especially someone who didn't believe maybe in God or something like that, they're like, wow, there's some power here that I was not aware of. And we can understand that. But then they couldn't understand the interpretation also made him as fearful. Just as fearful, it seems, as seeing that hand written on the wall. one of the things that is talked about is why was he so fearful? We don't know. But certainly, it may have to do with the Persians outside the gate. Maybe it's now dawning on him that, I can't understand this, but now there is impending doom outside the gates here. The Persian army's here. I don't know what this means. I don't have any security because I can't get any answers to the question of what happened, what I just did. And I also wonder if it brings back that thought about, I remember what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He was turned into, his sanity was taken from him, and he became like a beast. I also wonder if he had fear because he said, I know what happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. Is that what's going to happen to me? No one knows the answer to this. I have no idea what's going to be done to me by this Judean God, which I have so offended. I think it's pretty clear to him, that this was come from the Judean God because, even later on, he kind of points out to Daniel that he says, I know you're from Judea. I know that, these things have transpired, and part of it, I think, he was wary of what happened. Anyways, what happens next, though, is with the queen. Because the queen is then who reveals where he can find truth. And the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall. And one thing to understand about the queen, again, we believe this to be a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. And the queen, as a daughter, probably had a lot more firsthand knowledge of things that happened with Nebuchadnezzar during that reign. And I think the other part here is when I say queen, the queen here, I think it's understood to be Nabonidus' wife and Belshazzar's mother. Because if you read earlier in the text, the King Belshazzar, had invited his wives and his concubines to the banqueting hall. So his wives and his concubines were already there at the feast. And when this queen comes in, seems like this queen has not been at the feast. So it's kind of like then the question of like, if his wives and his concubines were there, then why isn't the queen there? Well, I think it makes sense again if we understand Nabonidus being his father, and that his wife was Nebuchadnezzar's daughter and also his mother. The queen is really the queen mother coming in, and she would not have been at the feast. This is her son doing things. So anyways, that's also sort of the understanding from this text as well, I think, from a number of commentaries that have looked at this and so forth, that this queen is the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar and also his mother. And here's about what has happened with, now her son comes to, give counsel to him. And she declares, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. And, something that I think I didn't always appreciate is Daniel's kind of known as an interpreter of dreams. Well, this isn't a dream, right? There's a writing, and no one can read the writing. So it's kind of similar to the second dream, where it's kind of like, I'm not going to tell you the dream, but you tell me the dream, and you tell me the interpretation. Here it's like, we don't know what the writing is, what this is saying, and then you need to figure that out. You also need to figure out what the interpretation is of that writing. And this is someone who can interpret dreams, but as it says here, he can also explain riddles and, solve problems. So I don't know, there's quite a bit that Daniel probably did that's not recorded here, that he did for Nebuchadnezzar that helped in ways that, we just don't know about. But the queen, Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, knew about that knew about the different ways, probably, her being there. And so anyways, I just, remark upon this, because this is like, to me, in some ways, it's a different sort of thing. You could say, well, God's given me the ability to interpret dreams, but now we have something that's not a dream. What am I supposed to do? Well, I mean, of course, Daniel had confidence in God, but we're like, wow, where do you begin? You have to be then, once more, given knowledge somehow, knowledge that you yourself don't possess, just like chapter 2. To have that sort of confidence in God that says, God, I have no way of solving this. I have no knowledge even of understanding what I'm supposed to solve. I've had problems sometimes at work, and I said, I don't know where to start, but at least I could plug away at it somehow. But when you think about the problem presented to Daniel, when I think about it, I'm like, this is so impressive, I think, of Daniel saying, you know what, I don't even know where to start. I don't think he would have known where to start. None of these men knew where to start. No one on their own, man-made or man intellect abilities knew where to start with these things. And yet Daniel still, has this confidence in God that God's going to give him this knowledge. God's going to give him this ability. Anyways, and the other thing I remark here is, Daniel, when they're calling for him, he's now 81 years old. He's not the 15-year-old boy anymore, or the 18-year-old boy that came to interpret the first dream. So he's quite a bit older at this point. And it's also, we don't see him among the astrologers and the Chaldeans, the enchanters, all the ones that Nebuchadnezzar had put him over. But we also know in chapter 1 that he says that Daniel remained in that position till Darius. So he remained in his position until Darius came. And we'll see later on that it seems that Daniel did hold a position of some sort within Babylon. It wasn't like they had to go far to find him. And it's mentioned later on in Daniel's visions. Some of his visions happened during King Belshazzar's reign. So it seems like he is somewhere in Babylon having some position still, maybe a governmental position, not just a astrologer and enchanter, wise man sort of position, but somewhere where he's administratively in charge of things. So anyways, that's some of the things as well, I think, where God had kept him established in a way, continued to have him used in blessing people that didn't honor God, but Daniel was still there as a blessing for them during that time. And lastly, we get into then, Daniel interprets the writing on the wall. But, looking at our time, I'm not going to get in too much for that. But I do think one of the things that's brought out as well is that, again, as I already mentioned with Daniel, I think this courage that Daniel has, no matter what the circumstance is, to trust that God's going to help him with that circumstance. We don't see all that yet, but I think we've seen that time and time again. And even if it's a different circumstance that we've never encountered before, or that Daniel, it's a different circumstance, never quite encountered the same sort of thing before. I don't think he ever had to interpret a finger that wrote something on a wall before, that wrote something that no one else knew. But with all these new challenges, there's just that great confidence that, the first confidence would be is that God must have a way to help in this situation. Even if, we don't maybe see that from the text, I think that's part of what we understand of Daniel's faith. And to me, that's part of the challenge, that there's no problem too great or too small. Sometimes I think when there's a problem and we can't figure it out, then we say, let's go to God. But I think even maybe in simple ones, yeah. Yeah. Right, and that's the comment Richard just made, that the other pattern we see with Daniel is he is also, in a way we would say, a humble man. He makes sure that God is given the glory, that people understand that this is not his wisdom, that this isn't his ability that is doing that, but that this is by God who has given him this insight, which again stands as a witness, right? I know that seems a little bit, if you think about today in the workplace, if you were to tell someone else, they said, well, God, a coworker or something like that, he says, well, I think God has given me the ability to understand this problem here. They'd be like, okay. Yeah, you're right, though. He was very forthright with everyone about where he got his ability from to do these things, where he got the wisdom and insight from. And I think, yeah, that's to his credit that we probably don't give God the credit for things as much as maybe we should as a witness. I don't know. It's something to think about anyways. It's a good point. All right, I'm going to just close then in prayer. We'll get into the rest of Daniel chapter 5 next week. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you once more for all that you have accomplished in people's lives to bring people here into repentance, into faith, into the trust that we have that you are both the God who was, the God who is, and the God who will be, the God who forever reigns. We thank you once more for your word. We thank you for this example that we see through Daniel, who trusts you, who is used by you, and who is your witness to these Babylonians, and also an example to his people. We pray that you might help us to spend time in your word, to be bold in our witness, that we may, as was said, always give you the glory in things. And I thank you once more for this time in which we could spend together. May you bless the worship in the next hour.